The Mabinogion, Part 2, the story of Branwen. It was the happiest of days in Aberfraw on Anglesey. In an enormous tent overlooking the sea, Branwen, princess of the island of the mighty, had married Matholwch, king of Ireland. Long live Matholwch and Branwen, called King Bendigeidfran. Bendigeidfran was Branwen's brother, and a giant of a man. No house was big enough to hold him. That's why the wedding was taking place in a tent. Bendigeidfran smiled at his sister and her husband, who was sitting beside him at the table. Only a week had gone by since Matholwch had sailed from Ireland to ask for Branwen's hand in marriage. Bendigeidfran had willingly given his consent. This marriage would unite two countries in friendship. What could be better? Long live our two peoples, called Matholwch, with a smile for his lovely wife. Long live our friendship, replied the Welsh and the Irish, with smiles for each other. The sound of their laughter spilled across the fields and reached the ears of a rider who was galloping northward. The man stopped and glowered at the direction of Aberfraw. Bendigeidfran's holding a banquet, he grumbled to himself, and he's having a good time too. Why didn't he tell me? The rider's name was Efnisien, and he was Branwen and Bendigeidfran's half-brother. Instead of continuing on his journey, he galloped across the country to the king's yard. There he dismounted in a hurry and made for the nearest stable. It was full of strange horses. Whose horses are they? He called to a servant. They belong to Matholwch, the servant replied. Matholwch? exclaimed Efnisien. King of Ireland? What's he doing here? He's just married your sister, the young man said proudly. What? The look on Efnisien's face frightened the boy. He took a step back, but Efnisien caught hold of his tunic. You're telling me that Branwen has married Matholwch? He shouted in his face. Yes. Without asking me? What right did she have to marry without asking me? Efnisien snatched a knife from his belt. The servant gasped in fright and fell against the wall of the stable. Efnisien was attacking the horses. He was hacking at their tails and cutting off their ears. This is my wedding present for Matholwch, he bellowed. The servant jumped to his feet and ran for his life. He ran all the way to the wedding tent with screams of horses echoing in his ears. He made his way to the high table and whispered his message to Bendigeidfran and his brother Mabinogion. And the two got up at once and left the tent. Matholwch hardly noticed. He only had eyes for his lovely wife Branwen. But three of his servants had seen Bendigeidfran depart in a hurry, so they followed him. They came back, red-faced with rage. The Welshmen of this island have made a fool of you, they spluttered. To Matholwch, whilst you were feasting, they attacked your horses. That can't be true, said Matholwch. It is true, insisted the stewards. Listen. Matholwch listened. The laughter in the tent died away, and from across the fields came the painful, pitiful neighing of horses and the terrified rattle of their hooves. You must leave now, said his stewards. You've been insulted. A king should not be insulted in this way. No, agreed Matholwch. A king should never be insulted. Come, my men, he ordered. We're going back to our own country. Without a word to his wife, Matholwch left the tent and headed down towards the sea, where his 13 ships were waiting for him. King Bendigeidfran was standing on the stable yard with his huge hand clamped around his half-brother's arm. He looked down the hill and saw the Irishman headed for the shore. Efnisien, he said sadly, look at the trouble you've caused. Me? Scoffed Efnisien, pulling himself free. It was you who let our sister marry the King of Ireland. You're the fool, Bendigeidfran. A fool is a man who's always quarrelling and taking offence, said Bendigeidfran. If you weren't my half-brother, I'd have you punished. The giant called Mabinogion and the two other men was called. Go to Matholwch as once, he ordered. Tell him I'll replace all the horses that were injured. Efnisien snorted. And I'll give a silver cane and a gold plate as big as his face, said the giant. Ask Matholwch to come back here so that we can be friends once more. Fool! Yelled Efnisien, leaping onto his horse. Bendigeidfran shook his head as he watched him ride away. Efnisien was a bitter man. He caused great unhappiness wherever he went. The giant was glad to see the back of his half-brother. Down below on the beach, Mandewyddan had caught up with Matholwch, the King of Ireland. Bendigeidfran watched them closely, and when he saw the Irishman turn away from the sea, Bendigeidfran hurried to meet him. With a smile on his face, he led Matholwch back to the tent where Branwen was waiting for him. Matholwch sat by his wife as before, but to the giant's disappointment the young man was gloomy and ill at ease. "You're still brooding on the wrong that was done to you," said Bendigeidfran kindly. "I know how you feel, and that's why I'm going to offer you another gift." "What sort of a gift?" said Matholwch. "A magic cauldron," the giant replied. "It's known as the Cauldron of Rebirth. When one of your soldiers dies in battle, put him in the cauldron and he'll come back to life." "I've heard of the cauldron that brings soldiers back to life," said Matholwch excitedly. "Then you shall have it," said Bendigeidfran. "And I'll accept with gratitude," replied Matholwch. "You have proved yourself a true friend, because only a true friend could offer such a valuable gift." The king cheered up. He began to talk merrily once more and to smile at his wife Branwen. The next morning they both sailed for Ireland. From the deck of the ship, Branwen looked back at the island of the mighty. The sun was dancing on her brother Bendigeidfran's armour. She watched till the very last glimmer had disappeared. Matholwch put his arm around her. "You'll be as happy in Ireland as you were in your homeland," he said to his wife. "I promise you." And for a whole year, Matholwch's promise held true. For 1 whole year, Branwen was happy in Ireland. The Irish thought the world of their queen. She was so pretty and so friendly and so generous. Before the end of the year, she gave birth to a son. His name was Gwern. Gwern was sent to the best school in Ireland where he could learn to be king. King Matholwch had told no one of the wrong that had been done to him on the island of the mighty. But as the months went by, rumours reached the ears of his foster brothers. "What's this we hear?" they demanded. "Is it true that your horses were maimed at the time of your wedding?" "Well," began Matholwch, "so the Welsh have brought shame on the King of Ireland." "Not all the Welsh," said Matholwch, "only one man." "But that man is Branwen's half-brother," said the brothers angrily. "You must punish your wife." "Certainly not," replied Matholwch. "Branwen has done nothing wrong. She didn't deserve to be punished." "If you intend to remain king, you must punish her," insisted the brothers. Matholwch realized they meant what they said. If he didn't punish Branwen, one of them would take his place. "All right," he muttered. Branwen will no longer be queen. She'll be sent to work in the kitchen." "That's not enough of a punishment," snapped the eldest brother. "Tell the butcher to box her ears every morning after he's finished chopping the meat." With the brothers watching, Matholwch gave the order. He heard the soldiers lay hold of Branwen and drag her to the kitchen. He heard her cry out to him. Matholwch turned his back and fled from the court. One of his stewards followed him. This steward had been a guest at Matholwch's wedding. "Sire," he whispered in the king's ear, "you must stop our people visiting the island of the mighty, and if the people of that island land on our shores, you must order your soldiers to imprison them. We don't want the Welsh to hear what's happening to Branwen." Matholwch shuddered. The steward was right. He didn't want anyone to hear of Branwen's punishment, especially not the giant Bendigeidfran. From that day on, Branwen worked in the castle kitchen. The baker shouted at her, the butcher boxed her ears, and the other servants made fun of her. Her only friends were the birds that came to the window. One little starling was bolder than the rest. Whenever Branwen was on her own, he flew into the kitchen and stood on the mixing bowl and sang to her. If anyone else came into the room, he hid among the dishes. One afternoon a dog came into the kitchen. "Ruff, ruff," barked the dog. Chirped the starling. "You're talking to the dog," said Branwen, laughing for the first time in months. "What a clever little bird you are. Do you think you could talk to me too?" From that day on, Branwen talked to the starling. Whenever the kitchen was quiet, she would stand on the window Looking eastwards towards the sea, the starling perched on her shoulder and listened to stories about the island of the mighty and the giant Bendigeidfran, and he learned to say fra, fra when she talked of her brother. He learned to groan too. Every morning the butcher boxed Branwen's ears, and every morning she groaned in pain. And one day when the butcher hit her harder than usual, the starling took fright and fled through the window, and he flew in a wide arc and came back to Branwen. Fra, he sang. You want me to fly to my brother Bendigeidfran, said Branwen sadly. I can't, little bird. The starling fluttered his wings and stared at her with the bright, beady eyes. Fra, he sang. The next day Branwen wrote a message on a scrap of paper. As soon as she felt the breeze blow towards east, she tied the message to the starling's wing and carried him to the window. At once the starling rose into the air and flew across the wild waves. He flew on and on and on till he saw the green hills and a man as tall as a tree. The tired starling landed on the man's shoulder and let large, giant, gentle hands take the message from under his wing. A week later, as Branwen was hard at work kneading the dough, she heard startled voices. She looked through the window and saw men running in the direction of the sea. Sire, sire, they called the king. We've seen a strange sight. A forest is sailing across the sea. In the midst of the forest there is a moving mountain, and on top of the mountain there's a narrow ridge with a lake each side. A mountain moved across the sea. Matholwch was scared. The mountain was coming westward from the island of the mighty. Go to Branwen, he gabbed. Ask her what she thinks it is. The men hurried to the kitchen. Branwen had stopped kneading. She was sitting at the table with her hands in her lap. There are strange sights out at sea, cried the men. Please tell us what's happening, Queen Branwen. Branwen raised her eyes. I have not been queen for 3 whole years, she said quietly. I am only a kitchen maid, but today I shall be a princess once more, because my brother, the king, is coming to rescue me. Your brother, said the men. Indeed, replied Branwen. The trees you saw are the masts of my people's ships, and the mountain beside them is my brother, Bendigeidfran. He is walking through the sea, because there is not a ship in the world that can hold him. But we saw 2 lakes, said the men. The lakes are his glowering eyes, one each side of his long nose, said Branwen. They are full of anger towards Ireland because you've been so cruel to his sister. The men hurried back to inform their king, Matholwch. Matholwch was more terrified than ever. How could he escape from the Welsh and their giant king? He called his stewards. We must cross the river Liffey and destroy the bridge behind us, advised the stewards. No man can cross the magic Liffey without a bridge. Matholwch and his men escaped across the Liffey and smashed the bridge. As the last plank fell into the water, the earth trembled and a huge shadow fell over them. Bendigeidfran was standing on the far side of the river. He who is the leader must also be the bridge, he said to his men. Matholwch turned pale. What does he mean? Asked the stewards. Bendigeidfran is the leader of the Welsh, so he's going to make a bridge for them, Matholwch whispered. Before the words were out of his mouth, the giant had laid across the river, so his head was on the bank on which Matholwch stood. One by one his men began to run across his broad back. Matholwch retreated in a hurry and sent messengers to bargain with Bendigeidfran. Sire, said the messengers, Matholwch wants to bring this quarrel to an end. To prove it, he has a special gift for you. You've never lived in a house because you're so tall. Matholwch plans to build a house that's large enough for a giant and fit for a king. Bendigeidfran shook his head. What good is a house, he asked, when you have been so cruel to my sister? Your sister is free, said the messengers. Look, here she comes. Bendigeidfran, Bendigeidfran. Branwen was running towards the river. Bendigeidfran reached out his long arms, lifted her across the water, and held her tight. Tell Matholwch to build the house, said Branwen. I've had enough of this hatred and quarrelling. I want us to be friends once more. Friends, said a scoffing voice. The Irish don't know the meaning of the word. Efnisien was standing on the riverbank, sword in hand. You're the one who doesn't know the meaning of the word, growled the giant. You make every man your enemy. Put away your sword, Efnisien. I'm going to accept Matholwch's gift. Bendigeidfran and his men set up camp on the riverbank and waited for the house to be built. As Matholwch had promised, it was a house unlike any other house that had been seen before. It stood taller than the tallest tree, with 100 pillars to support the roof. Once the house was finished, Efnisien was the first to go inside. He stalked from room to room, and when he saw 2 bulging sacks that hung from each of the 200 pillars, he bared his teeth with savage glee. "What's in those sacks?" he asked the Irishman who was standing at the door. "Flour," replied the man. "Flour?" said Efnisien. "Then why are they wriggling?" In one swift move he pounced on the nearest sack and crushed it with all his strength. From the sack came a scream of pain. Inside was an armed soldier. The other sacks began to wriggle and squirm. Efnisien ran from one to the other and crushed the soldiers inside. When he had killed 200 men, he went to find Bendigeidfran. "I was right," he said triumphantly. "Matholwch tricked us. He wants to destroy us." "No, no," said Bendigeidfran. "Look, here comes Matholwch with his little son Gwern. Matholwch intends to make our nephew king in his place. Our 2 countries will be united." "Never!" With a scream of rage, Efnisien snatched the boy from his father's grasp, and before anyone could save him, he threw him onto the fire. At once the soldiers of both countries drew their swords and rushed into battle. Bendigeidfran picked up his poor sister and sheltered her under his shield. "Bendigeidfran will kill us all," cried the Irish when they saw the giant coming towards them. "No, have no fear," Matholwch told them. "I have a magic cauldron. It's known as the Cauldron of Rebirth. If you're killed in battle, the cauldron will bring you back to life." With a proud roar, the men of Ireland ran at the enemy. Meanwhile, the king's servants lit a fire under the magic cauldron. Each time an Irish soldier was killed, they placed the body inside, and within a few hours the man was restored to life and ready to fight once more. When Efnisien saw what was happening, he was beside himself with rage. "Why did you give that cauldron to Matholwch?" he shouted at Bendigeidfran. "Because of you," the giant replied sadly. "You have destroyed us, Efnisien." "Never!" Efnisien dropped on all fours and crept towards the bodies that were lying on the ground. He hid under the dead Irishman till Matholwch's servants picked him up and placed him in the cauldron. As soon as they let go, Efnisien jumped to his feet. Using his arms and legs, he pushed with all his strength. He kept on pushing and pushing until the cauldron shattered into tiny pieces. The effort was so great that he himself fell dead. With the destruction of the cauldron, the Welsh won the battle against Matholwch and his men. But it was a sad and terrible victory. At the end of the day, only 7 Irishmen were left alive. Bendigeidfran himself had been mortally wounded by a poisonous spear. As he lay dying, he asked his friends to take his head to the Island of the Mighty and bury it beneath the White Hill in London, with his face turned towards France. The next day, at the mouth of the River Allow, in Anglesey, a little Starling watched a ship draw close to the shore. Of all the ships that sailed to Ireland, this was the only one that returned. On board were 7 soldiers and the head of Bendigeidfran. Also on board was Branwen. The Starling heard her weep for her little son, for all the good men that were lost, and for the 2 noble countries that were destroyed. Before he could fly to her side, he heard her heart break into 2. And that's the end of the story of Branwen.